Welcome to CanAg Unpacked. I'm your host, Bob Friesen. Back with us, Wayne Easter, a 28-year veteran of the House of Commons, former Canadian top cop as Attorney General under Prime Minister Paul Martin, and longtime chair of the House of Commons Finance Committee. Welcome, Wayne.
Good to be here.
Then our special guest today is Greg Northey, who is president of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance. Welcome, Greg.
Hi, Bob. Hi, Wayne.
Good day.
Okay, what I would like to talk to about today, Greg, or let's start with that anyway. Tell us a little bit about your organization.
Yeah, so CAFTA was originally formed at the end of 1997. So this was the period. So the Uruguay round had ended as far as trade negotiations go, or multilateral trade negotiations had ended. And so the groups that represented Canadian farmers and processors who export decided to form a loose group at that point. So it was called CAFTA. And I think, a lot of the driver would have been around how to prepare that sector with that very specific focus on exports, how to work together in a coalition or a group. So that was the end of 1997, and then CAFTA was officially incorporated in 2003.
Okay, and who would be your members?
Yeah, so 12 members right now. So it includes a lot of the grain groups. So Pulse Canada, Canola Growers, Canola Council, Soy Canada, Cereals Canada, as well as on the meat side, support Canadian Pork Council, Canadian Cattle Association, Canadian Sugar Institute, CropLife Canada, and Canadian Food and Health Consumer Products as well.
Was there a feeling that governments weren't aggressive enough finding international markets, or what? There must have been a feeling that there was a vacuum there, was there?
Well, I think, and Bob, you'd probably be familiar with this as well. I think there was just a desire when it came, especially because that was a very volatile period. There's a lot happening with multilateral trade, right? And so Canada has, we're the fifth largest exporter, and a huge portion, over 50-60% of what we produce and either grow or process is exported. And so there's a lot of associations in Canada, and I think there was clearly a need at that point, and continues to be a need for an organization that has a very singular focus, which is on, exports and what that looks like within trade negotiations and trade deals. And so, a very, very singular focus, but an important one. And I think that's why membership continues to see value now.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly. In fact, I met with some of the gentlemen at the time that wanted to start this organization, and I think the feeling was at the end of the Uruguay round, supply management had such a strong lobby, and of course that lobby was all focused on retaining Article 11. But there was such a strong lobby from supply management, I guess they felt there was a need for exporters also to have a place at the table.
I think so, and because trade, at that point, this concept of, not new concept, we had the GATT before that, but because there was so much discussion, Uruguay round, and then clearly a desire at that point to start to look at agriculture specifically, right, which ended up becoming, fundamental to the Doha round, just became an important element to make sure that there was that voice for those who want to export. And, it was clearly filling a bit of a void at that point. Obviously the different groups could have their specific focus, but because exports are so important to Canada, that was the hole that CAFTA was filling there.
Wayne, you have a comment or a question?
CAFTA has provided, I think, necessary, and I was involved in those times. Sometimes we worked against each other, sometimes we worked together. But they provided the necessary pressure on the government in terms of looking at all of the aspects of the agricultural community. It just couldn't be supply management. You got a lot of export industries, whether it's grains, pulse crops, whatever it might be. And so they were, I think in 1997, through in my early years in the Chrétien and Martin governments. They were a necessary component to put pressure on for the whole broad picture of agriculture, value added, and what it means to the Canadian economy. So a very very important organization from the beginning. Sometimes I will admit there's a problem in terms of an attack on supply management from some within. And my view was always we have to make this a win-win. The export industries are critical. Supply management's also critical. So how can we make this a win-win? And that's always a dilemma.
Yeah, for sure, and
So,
that's still the sorry, Bob, but I was just going to comment on. I mean, that's still the focus, right? We need both. Canada has both systems, and so we're unique in that way, in many respects for a country like Canada, which is such a massive exporter, and it is just trying to find that balance and make sure the voices are heard.
so how do you go about trying to synchronize or at least work adjacent to organizations that also work for supply management? Is there a way to have them work together, or how does that work? Because I know CFA would tell you that they are just as interested in promoting export markets as they are in making sure supply management stays intact. Do you work with the CFA at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, the CFA for sure. The difference would be that they have to balance both sides, right? And so CAFTA can be very much more singularly focused. But the reality is that when CFA is representing producers that export as well, and so they do have a voice on trade as well, and so we have the benefit of being able to really hone in on free and fair trade, and that be our thing. But on things like, say, for example, the Cairns Group, for example, which is a group that brings together associations across exporting countries, like CFA sits on that, as well as CAFTA, and we try and make sure that we can have a combined message from the Canadian perspective. And so, for sure, when there's things that it makes sense, where CFA has the ability to take a very robust position on trade that within their own membership, we'll always look for opportunities like that. But just the reality is that we have very different mandates around it. Like, we have a very crystal clear cut mandate around it, and it's what we talk about. It's all we talk about. So
Yeah, I mean, you're not a general farm organization,
exactly.
nor is supply management a general farm
Yeah.
organization, right? So it takes
Yeah.
organizations like the provincial general farm organizations as well as CFA to try to go down the middle. Wayne, you're smiling.
Well, yeah, I remember some of the early meetings, and Greg might. I doubt if Greg was around then, and I forget who it was. But with Goodale when we were in, and I forget. I think it was GATT, where we had this wonderful idea of bringing over to some of the discussions all the organizations, and sometimes it was a zoo with so many varied opinions, but eventually it coalesced into, well, we got to represent Canada here, and the ministers got to hear our voice, and we got to hear their voice too. I think at the end of the day, it all worked out, and both sides were critical in terms of the government coming to some of the decisions that it made. And one thing about Goodale, he was a good listener. He mightn't always agree with you, but he liked to have the various arguments there and then try and come to a conclusion. So yeah, that was the advent of I think bringing the whole industry into the negotiations with the various ministers at the different negotiations.
Yeah, I don't think Greg was born back at the end of the Uruguay round, but Goodell certainly was also the newly minted ag minister, you
Yeah,
will recall, Wayne,
yeah,
that had to walk into Geneva into a room full of supply management people saying, "Guys, we've lost Article 11." Now I want you to work with my officials to make sure you have similar tariff protection that you otherwise would have had under Article 11. So, how do you approach the government, Greg? You must have been very active, certainly during the bilaterals and plurilateral agreements that have been negotiated over the past, like CETA, CUSMA, CPTPP. How do you approach the government? Do you just say we want absolute free trade, or do you have a focused approach as to what you want the government to ask for, or what's your strategy there?
Yeah, so each deal is going to be a bit different, but the fundamental focus is still free and fair trade, right? To reduce as many of those many of those barriers, and increasingly, tariffs were always the bigger one earlier, and they still remain the same for certain countries or regions. But it's non-tariff trade barriers. It's all the elements that now go into these comprehensive trade deals, and the focus really is on identifying them, like from a sectoral standpoint, that then we can elevate through CAFTA and emphasize, but just that broader sense that yes, as Canada approaches these deals, the focus has to be on opening trade as much as possible, making free and fair for exporters, because ultimately we're not the only ones trying to access these markets. And so this is also the point we consistently make, that we have to be competitive. We have to diversify our markets away from the ones that are consistently large for us, but are also can be worrisome that we're seeing right now. That we need to be competitive, and we're not always super competitive in those markets, and so trade deals are one of the ways to do it. And for sure, it's a hard balance. We totally understand for the government having to balance it, like with the supply management system and exports. But increasingly also, that I'd say that might be different from back then, or maybe not, is that because we have such a strong focus on just the conceptual idea of free trade, which isn't necessarily always a popular idea now at the moment, right? Like we're seeing a retrenchment from global trade systems and everything else, and more protectionism more generally, like from countries that usually would have been focused on trade. The fact that we still are so focused on that, and providing government support for that in forums and venues, and speaking to our counterparts around the world about the benefits of trade. So it's not just advocacy with our government now. It's going across the board for everybody that there is benefit to it, and that's becoming harder and harder, I would say, because not everyone is enamored with the concept, right, or the belief that this whole multilateral trade or globalization or whatever you want to call it has been beneficial. And so, we're still sort of trying to be that beacon of light for that as well.
One of those folks would be Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean it's and it's a lot of countries right now that are looking at erecting barriers, right? I mean
we've kind of retrenched, and we're the world is kind of retrenched, and I think we're all going to suffer as a result. Trade opens up. It opens up so many things and makes everybody more prosperous and more efficient.
Well, and it's you're right. I mean, the U.S. administration right now is throwing a monkey wrench into everything by just simply giving the finger to a trade agreements. But you also have the countries that are magnanimous when it comes to saying, yes, we want freer trade. Let's lower the tariffs. Let's expand TRQs, and then later on just apply non-tariff trade barriers, non-scientific based tariff barriers, and that's been a real challenge as well. One of the things I remember talking to Steve Huell about countless times was, something you guys need to, when you negotiate a trade agreement, you also have to look at how Canada can harmonize its regulatory regime with that country, without compromising safety, of course, but there also has to be some sort of regulatory alignment, so they can't raise all kinds of non-tariff trade barriers.
Yeah, and that's becoming a larger and larger part of the work, right? Because, like I said, in a lot of cases, the tariffs, all the work that was done with WTO previously, the tariffs are less of an issue, although obviously we're seeing the resurgence of those, but it is within those trade deals now. It's like what does that regulatory harmonization look like? What do the committees look like where you can work with countries around the science-based focus that they put on making sure that these barriers don't go up. But yeah, I mean it's amazing now. I'm sure it must be all the work that both of you probably did during those those early negotiations to reduce tariffs, to now see this seemingly acceptance of a blanket 10% tariff around the world, right? It's a whole. It's very strange to see, because the work done into trying to eliminate that kind of thing seems to have just disappeared.
It's kind of has disappeared at the moment, and then there's the other side related to the point that Bob made, is sometimes our regulatory requirements here are overly onerous. I mean, we don't have the crop protection chemicals they do that in the United States, and you'd see that especially in the grain and those kind of industries. We even see it in potatoes here in PEI. There's product available to the Americans that their system says is safe, that for whatever reason the Pest Management Review Agency doesn't, or they want you to pay these absolutely horrendous fees in order to get it tested to see if it meets our regulatory requirement, and we're 10% of the size of the United States. And so a company that's trying to sell the product says, hell with that. I'm not going to pay those kind of fees for that small a market. I know we think we're big, but we're not. That's the other area, Bob. We need a level playing field, is on the crop protection side, so that our farmers can remain competitive.
Well, of course, and you know this as well as anybody, Wayne, that the PMRA has a risk cup. And if that risk cup is filled because the pesticide was used on products imported from the U.S., then suddenly Canadian farmers no longer have access to that product because the risk cup is full. You're absolutely right. What have the I mean, I think we probably all agree that for the moment, at least, the WTO is probably dead in the water. I don't see anything happening there with the U.S. administration. They're certainly not going to do anything. I mean, one of the reasons we always liked the WTO was because that's where we could get some discipline on domestic support. But the U.S. isn't about to start disciplining their domestic support. In fact, my guess is they're way over their Uruguay round entitlements or commitments because of the subsidies that they're currently affording to farmers because of their tariff war. So I don't think the WTO is going anywhere. However, Canada was lucky enough, or we were lucky enough, that our government was aggressive with regional and bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements. Have you seen those agreements benefit your members, Greg?
Yeah, they're always a benefit. You know, either they're dropping tariffs, or they're addressing some of these non-tariff trade barriers, or they're slowly ramping up or improving TRQ situations. So they're all important. You know, CPTPP, CETA, the bilaterals that we've done. You know, it's always important because what it does is it brings that discipline. If we're not going to have it through WTO, it brings it through other mechanisms, and they're ambitious. You know, that just to the point on MRLs or even plant breeding innovation, these kind of things, the ability to have agreement across two countries or a broad swath of countries around how to manage those, how to treat those, how to ensure they don't become trade barriers. It's always important. And so, you know, it's never automatic. You know, the belief, you know, you sign a trade deal and all of a sudden the product's going to flood in. We have to compete in these markets, and obviously the global prices will always change, so it'll be up and down. But there's high value markets that we're opening up, and we expect to see more of that. I mean, right now we're looking at ASEAN. There's a trade negotiation underway. Philippines, Indonesia, like a large focus on the Indo-Pacific, and and that's the kind of place where we need to get into. And so we would always advocate, paving the way to Canadian agri-food diversification and exports has to come through a really structured negotiation process.
So there would be critics of trade agreements that would say, well, exporters' volume hasn't gone up into X number of countries, so what good was the trade agreement? Would you agree that if tariffs are reduced, it might not actually increase the volume you ship into that country, but it might make your market access more profitable? Would that be the case?
Yeah, that's that. And it always depends a little bit on the commodity and what global markets are saying and who wants it, right? It's not that displacing a market that we already have for another market where we just signed a trade deal isn't going to be automatic, and so it's giving options, because ultimately what we've learned now when we see things like China closing and India closing in the past for us and various things is that we need these options, and so the trade deals developing the market there as a result of them, and ultimately it is the high value. I think you're right in that. We were adding value here in Canada. The more we process, the more we can go into a market like the EU, for example. And so, it is that optionality that it brings. And so, you can't really look at the overarching number to see how important it is. For something like the EU, for instance, the discipline that deal is meant to bring around, say, non-tariff trade barriers, particularly, is something that we need to continue to work on, right? Where the different EU's looking at a lot of different rules around MRLs, like you just talked about pesticides. Their view on these things is very different, and so having a trade deal with them is clearly the best avenue to try and address those. It's not going to happen automatically, but that's the whole point of them. So they're not a silver bullet, but they're the best way to start working with different countries.
Wayne?
Yeah, in the European market's a prime example, like hormones in cattle.
Exactly.
And so the beef's open, the market's open to our cattle, but we can't get them in unless we have a plant that is only going to, or at least for while the processing's happening, only going to process cattle that haven't been have an industry that hasn't been using hormones in order to get faster growth in terms of those cattle. So that ends up being a non-tariff trade barrier. The market's open, but it's not open for the way that we handle cattle to a great extent in this country. There's lots of cattle that aren't given implants for growth and so on, but there's no specific plants that only handle that type of cattle. So the market's ineffective, not open.
Yeah.
So you run into all those kind of things. But I think the key point that Greg made is we need the options. We need options right around the world, because if something happens in one market, well, at least we've got an agreement where we can try and move product to another market. It may be further processed product. It may be raw product, but in any event, those options are what we need through various and multiple trade agreements.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with that. And one of the things we were talking about when we had the president of Pulse Canada on our podcast, and Greg, you represent Pulse Canada on CAFTA. I think that's why you're the president there. Yeah. He was talking about the benefit of working with industry in those countries as well, not just allow everything for the governments to do, but rather have industry to industry discussions as well, so that when governments start doing stupid things, at least you have industry supporting each other in those countries. And he also emphasized the importance of letting demand kind of dictate where you look for markets. It's a lot better trying to fill a demand than it is trying to force a demand, such as what they're trying to do in the U.S., and we have yet to see exactly how effective that's going to be. But let's talk a little bit about China and the U.S. Scott Moe, the Saskatchewan Premier, yesterday, he published the demand. Everybody, all the premiers that appears are making demands of the new federal government now. And on one of Scott Moe's demands, he included that Canada should post haste start negotiating with China on agricultural products. My guess is they've probably done it ever since China implemented that counter tariff. But my guess is your organization would want that to happen as quickly as possible. Do you have a sense whether officials, in fact, have been talking to China already?
Yeah, well, I mean that it's we don't have a sense necessarily of that yet, that what it's going to look like, as far as a sort of a, there needs to be an approach for China, so some kind of approach to improve their relationship. Obviously China congratulated the new prime minister on that, so there is an opening there. We're waiting to see what that first step looks like from Canada's perspective as to what that looks like. The Chinese market is very important for many Canadian economies. Commodities, and so improving relations with China, considering where they are now as far as the kind of connection that the government has with them is very important. Obviously, we need to diversify our markets and across the globe, but the current tariffs we're seeing from China on key Canadian commodities that go into China are a big problem, and there needs to be a pathway to be able to discuss with China how we address that, because from an agriculture perspective, it is extremely damaging for several different commodities. So we're kind of waiting to see what that looks like as far as how Canada approaches it. But our view and what we understand is it's in Canada's hands right now, what that looks like.
Well, the interesting thing is, I mean, they had the same thing happen, I don't know how many years ago, when this Yowie executive was under house arrest in BC, and the Chinese countered by putting a moratorium, I believe, on 2 canola exporters in Canada. Was there no thought that might happen again if we put 100% tariffs on SUVs? You just wonder why that wouldn't have been a consideration at the time. And perhaps, Wayne, you're the best one to answer it, because you were there for that.
No, I was. I've been there for some of the with the Huawei issue for sure. But obviously, in support of the whoever was doing the decided on the decision, whether it was pressure from the United States on EVs or what, I don't know. But whoever was doing that discussion, they obviously weren't thinking about the impact on the canola and the pea and other industries in terms of the retaliation that would come from China. So we basically traded off, in my view, and I'm critical of them for this, traded off one industry for another, or somebody didn't think of the implications. But Canada always has had more respect in China than most countries. And it goes back, and I know we have differences of opinion on the Canadian Wheat Board and what it could do and so on and so forth. But there was, first of all, Norman Bethune, who was a Canadian who was there, that is part of their history, and they respect Canada because of Norman Bethune and what he did in the early stages of the China we know now. And then there was the Canadian Wheat Board that provided for a hungry country wheat on credit when nobody else around the world would. Canadian Wheat Board's no longer there in its original way. But it is it's still Canada been recognized for being there when they had a hungry country. So I think we've got a good foundation of which to start some discussions. But on the EV thing, they seen as basically being subservient to the Americans and taking a hard position against China, and so you could expect they would retaliate, and they retaliated against what we all three would consider our industry.
Well, I mean, China at least started by going through the WTO motions of initiating an anti-dump, and hadn't applied any tariffs at the moment when they started that action. But then I think they saw Trump do what he did, and they said, well, why should we wait? Let's just slap a tariff on right away.
Yeah. we were, and many, all of us, the agriculture sector may have been alone in this at the time, but we were very clear about what the repercussions would have been from that EV tariff. You know, obviously there is broader geopolitical drivers for that, and so it's often hard to to be. So we understood that, but in all our correspondence, it was pretty clear. We're going to get hit with this, guys. And so I don't know whether they were surprised or whether they just had to make that calculation and sacrifice something. But it's been a problem, obviously.
The other thing, just to quickly come in here, Bob, and it's been my complaint forever in government. Why we have to be the Boy Scouts of the world when it comes to to issues, I don't know. The Americans, and you said it earlier, Bob, they are going to make sure the farmers down there can probably go to their mailbox and be compensated. Our Canadian, we got some good programs in Canada, yes, but we need to go beyond in terms of what the programs are when these kind of things that happen. If our competitors are doing it, then we have to step up to the plate and support our agriculture industry. It's a very important industry. So stop being the Boy Scouts and fight fire with fire, my view.
Talking about Boy Scouts, I remember calling Bill McKnight. You remember him, Wayne? Greg, you
I
won't
do.
remember him. He was the ag minister for a while under Brian Mulroney, and we were in Geneva at the trade ambassador's house for dinner, and we called him and his officials Boy Scouts, and he almost ejected out of his seat and started screaming that they were no Boy Scouts. And actually, one of our own delegation said, "Okay, guys, there's no need for shouting. Let's calm down a little bit." Anyway, what are we going to do with the U.S., Greg?
Well,
Magic answer, Greg. Magic answer.
It's a great. So CAFTA, we did go down. We were down there in April as a delegation. Pretty much every member was down there, and we had teams, and we met with 50, 60 stakeholders down there, and we had planned the meeting actually before the whole Liberation Day and before CUSMA started to be chipped away at, because we were anticipating the CUSMA renewal or renegotiation that was meant to happen next year, and we wanted to really promote the idea that this is an important trading relationship. Really cookie cutter stuff, basic stuff that we thought was just well known or accepted. And so they were very different, definitely very different meetings, because that couldn't necessarily. It was certainly part of our message that integrated supply chains, our countries rely on each other. Why are you basically ignoring a deal that we signed a few years ago and that has served everyone well. And so at this point now, we don't other than autos and steel and aluminum, we're in a comparatively to other countries in the U.S. market, we're comparatively better because we're still under CUSMA rules, we're still tariff free, everything is still operating. It's the uncertainty that's really the problem. And so we're seeing the indication that CUSMA is going to be the focus, that we are going to focus back on this sort of the trade deal we have and the policy implications around that. And so it's giving hopefully a structured focus to that, as opposed to what we were seeing before, which just seemed very random, fentanyl tariffs, this kind of thing. And so that's where we're going. We view that path as the path we want to be down. And so, I think like everybody, we're just waiting to see what happens in 90 days at the beginning of July with the reciprocal tariff situation, to see how all those other countries deal with that. And we'll keep focused on this concept that we have CUSMA, we have a trade deal. Let's take a look at it. Don't tear it up. Let's make it better. So, we're in a bit of this respite right now. It's a moment of reflection, I think, for everybody. If you're not in the autos and steel and aluminum world, but we're okay as far as the ag sector at the moment. Although that's not stopping. All of our members are down there a lot. Like every few weeks, they're going to be down there working with their colleagues down there, like you said, the business to business side, working with the buyers, everybody down there to try and drum up as much support for this idea that CUSMA should be the focus for the U.S.
Well, and
I
this is
think
where it's so important to have industry relationships, right?
Yeah.
Because the industry in the U.S. can tell their officials, look, we need this market or we need the border open because we rely on the products coming in from Canada and they rely on our products coming into Canada. Wayne?
Yeah, it's a two-way deal. There's no question about that. I guess the concern going forward is after what's already happened, you wonder, can you continue to trust the Americans? And I think that's a message that needs to get through to especially the Republicans. Greg, I chaired the Canada-U.S. Interparliamentary Group for quite a number of the last number of years. I was in Ottawa and was always on the committee. So I know a lot of the senators and quite a few of the congressional people down there, and why they don't stand up to Trump. Well, I really do understand why. They're number one afraid of their primary, and even deeper concerns than that. I think in terms of physical violence from some groups if they really stand up hard against Trump. Regardless of that, it's important to talk to those Republicans, especially Democrats too, but to talk to them, spell out to them the concerns and the impact on their own economy if they continue to go down this kind of a road that leads to trade wars. And they depend. I mean, the beef industry, for instance, is as integrated as the auto industry, and it's just not talked about that way. So there's implications in both countries. So congratulations to you folks and your component organizations for continuing to go down and meet with industry groups comparable to your own. But it's also critical, I think, to meet those representatives and those senators and be as direct as you can with them. I understand the pressure they're under, but golly, they've got to start to stand up.
Yeah, it's good. It's good advice. It's
Okay,
clearly what
we're
needs to happen.
almost out of time, but I'd like to Bill 282.
Yeah.
Now, because Parliament prorogued I don't think it ever made it all the way through the Senate. And because Parliament prorogued, that bill would be gone now. It would have to be retabled, I believe.
Yeah.
That had some concern for your members, I would guess.
Yeah, so just as background, that was a bill brought in by the Bloc Québécois, and it was meant to essentially enshrine the protection of supply management within the overarching legislation that governs Global Affairs Canada, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So including it within legislation, essentially, that supply management should be protected. And so, our view with that is that it's pretty. There doesn't seem to be there's almost no debate, and we saw it during the last election that supply management shouldn't be protected. Every party was clearly vocalizing that from policy. Government clearly vocalizes that to their trade negotiators, and so our view is that enshrining something like that in legislation isn't necessary. It actually ties our hands behind our back. It sets a precedent for any other country who want to negotiate who would say, well, sorry, it's in our legislation. We can't have it on the table. And so, we'd rather leave it to the negotiators to get the absolute best deal possible for. And it's not just an agriculture versus agriculture thing. That's the whole idea behind this is that everyone's going to have sensitive areas and they need to be discussed and put on the table and decisions have to be made. But we just didn't feel it was the right place for legislation. It wasn't necessarily about. There is no debate on supply management in the country. We don't think there's going to be, and so that was less of our issue. It's just that it just shouldn't be in legislation. But
Well, Bob, you'll not find a much stronger supporter of supply management than me. But I think that was the wrong approach. If you're going into any negotiations, basically everything has to be on the table. Your negotiators in your government can have in the back of their mind, we're not going to compromise on this. This is a no-go. But to have legislation that basically ties your hands is not the way to go. You got to have trust in your negotiators, trust in your government, that they are going to protect that industry because it's a very important component. But to have it by way of legislation, in my view, is not the right approach. And I'm a strong supporter of supply management. I think it
Well,
sends the wrong signal. As Greg said, it sends a signal to other countries. Does the United States not put sugar beets on because that's where they are on that one? Do other countries not do the same thing? So you can't negotiate that way.
well, and it's also a very complex issue, right? Supply management itself is a domestic policy, which is now basically in the same field as any other industry is when it comes to negotiating tariffs and TRQs. And there is already a component of negotiating sensitive products, and so that's already part of most discussions as well. Is there? Are you going to try to prevent it from coming back, or what are the chances that it will make its way back?
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister was asked that on the campaign trail, and he indicated that he didn't view legislation as necessary. So, very similar to what Wayne just mentioned, right? This idea that we strongly protect it. It doesn't need to be legislated, and so we would. Although the Bloc has said that they would put this as their number one bill that they want to bring to Parliament as a private member's bill, and so we would expect that to happen. I mean, this wasn't the first time this bill was in Parliament. It's been brought from some form of it has been brought for many years. It's just the confluence of events around 282 were somewhat unique in that you don't usually see a Bloc Québécois bill sort of make it that far and have the support of all parties, conservative, liberal, everybody else, right? Everyone was supporting that bill. So so we'll have to see. We anticipate seeing it again, but then if no one is promoting it as a private member's bill, or at least from a government side, or then you're not going to see it go very far. So we'll be watching carefully to see what happens with it.
Well, and there was actually a proposed amendment, I think, in the Senate too,
Yeah.
wasn't there?
Yeah.
That was going to mitigate a lot of the negative effects of that bill.
Yeah, it was well debated in the Senate, and there was the committee there had, I think, took a really good approach to it as well, and so they did amend it, and those amendments were positive in our view, and so it was just at the point where Parliament was prorogued, it was still at the committee report stage, so it hadn't gone to a full vote, but it looked like there was support for those amendments. So, yeah.
What it did, Bob, it sets up the stage for divisions in our own country that needn't be. It's a debate that need not be had. Carney has made it clear where he stands. He's going to be there for supply management. And the other side of the coin is the Americans have been given access into our into their dairy industry, and never, Trump Trump talks about a 250% or 300% tariff. They've never paid it. They've never hit that level. They've never filled the amount of dairy that they're allowed to ship into this country. So,
And that's free.
yeah, and that's free.
Yeah. Yeah, that was our view. Like I said, there is no debate around it, right? And so that's why it's often have a bill like that just creates tension where it doesn't have to be against agriculture, to two sides of agriculture. Where I would, like I said, it's not just that putting that in legislation isn't just about agriculture. That if you're the steel and aluminum, if you're forestry, or if you're autos, that kind of thing becomes an issue with them as well, right? Because you take that off the table, and all of a sudden everything else comes off the table. So, anyways, it's not a useful bill. So hopefully we'll see where it happens. But
All right, unless there's something else, there's one more issue. That is, we have a new agricultural minister.
yes, we do.
And he's from Wayne Easter's part of the country. I'm going to let him tell us how good he is or where he's going to need some fast learning.
Yeah, tell us about him. I'm curious.
Well, Heath MacDonald replaced me. He's in the same riding I was in, so he ran for the nomination after I decided not to run in 2021. So he's been an MP since then. So he's in a rural riding, mostly rural riding, and agriculture is the number one industry on Prince Edward Island. So he's got some background for sure. He wouldn't have a lot of background in the industries that you represent, Greg, in terms of canola, grains, and so on. I mean, we're more dairy, beef, mostly feed grains, and potatoes here. But in any event, he can certainly learn that. He was finance minister in the province
Mm.
here. And so he's got good experience in government and knows how important the agricultural industry is from that perspective as well. He is a good listener. I do think he probably will have to, when he's dealing with agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which I know well too, I think he's going to have to be more aggressive than typically he is in terms of saying, this is the agenda I want done. So be a little more aggressive than he has typically been, is I guess what I would put it up to. But he's a really good guy. He's a listener. I know he's been making calls to the industry, and he's a fairly fast learner. So I'm very hopeful.
And this is from the guy that suggested on a talk radio show when I was on it with him together that they should blow up the Sir John Carling building.
I said the top floor, just the top floor, Bob, because that's where the managers were at the time.
And then you weren't even there when they did blow it up. So have you had an opportunity to talk to him, Greg?
I haven't, no, but I know a lot of the heads of our member organizations have. I know he's been making a lot of those calls. So
Well,
that's
your
been,
boss
that's been
did
good.
mention that he'd talked to him. So
Yeah.
that's really good. I think that's really good proactive work. Is he a quick study, Wayne?
Yes, he is. He's a very quick study. Quite a sharp individual.
All right, gentlemen, that wraps it up. Thank you very much. Greg Northey, President of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Council, aka CAFTA, and Wayne Easter, a former parliamentarian and someone that knows pretty much everything about politics and about farming. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks for
Take
having me,
care.
guys. Appreciate it.
Good, good. Take care, folks. Bye bye.